Hi, everyone. I can see the attendees joining, so I'll give it a few minutes while everyone joins the room. Thanks so much for being here on Friday, March 7th, the day before International Women's Day. Welcome, everybody. It's slowly climbing up. This is great. It's really fun to see all the numbers come in. All right, everyone. Well, we will get started as I can just kick us off with a quick introduction and just a little bit of setting the scene of what you'll be seeing today. My name is Kelly Daly, and I oversee the Women Arts and Social Change Initiative at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. You also might hear NMWA. We're one and the same. I'm so glad you're joining us for this special conversation on the eve of International Women's Day. Each year, International Women's Day is a time to recognize the achievements of women across industries and reflect on the progress we've made and the work that still lies ahead. Here at NMWA, we champion women artists year-round. This is an important month for us, an important day for us, but the other 11 months are just as important. And today's program is a perfect way to celebrate their impact. So today's discussion is inspired by Uncanny, our latest exhibition, which opened on February 28th, and one that explores how women artists have used surreal, unsettling, and dreamlike imagery to subvert gender stereotypes and reclaim agency. We're thrilled to have NMWA curator Orin Zahra in conversation with two of the exhibition's artists, Fabiola Jean-Louis and Sheida Soleimani, as they discuss how their work uses feminist strategies of defamiliarization and resistance to shape their work. I'm going to give you a quick intro of who they are, but you'll hear from them soon. Sheida Soleimani is a multimedia artist based in Providence, Rhode Island. Sheida's work is a mixture of photography, performance, film, and sculpture, and is a critical view on the international politics and its power relationships. As the daughter of political refugees persecuted by the Iranian government in the 1980s, the intersection of art and activism is central to Sheida's work. In addition to her work in the art world, Sheida also operates a bird hospital and is a federally licensed wildlife rehabber, so you might see some birds pop up when she's on screen. Fabiola Jean-Louis is a multifaceted artist working and living in Brooklyn, New York. Her passion for the arts flourished while she attended the High School of Fashion Industries in New York and developed further into a passion for photography. Her work is multifaceted, layered, and intricate, often including herself and other models wearing elaborate costumes and intricate sculptures made entirely out of paper. In addition to being included in this exhibition, Fabiola also recently opened an exhibition at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. This exhibition, Waters of the Abyss, an intersection of spirit and freedom, is on view until May 25th, 2025. A huge thank you to our speakers for being here and to all of you for tuning in. Now, Orin Zahra is going to kick us off with an overview of the Uncanny exhibition, and then she'll be joined by Sheida and Fabiola for a conversation. You'll be able to drop your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And now I welcome Orin to the stage.
Thank you, Kelly. Can you see my screen? I've just gone ahead and shared my slideshow.
We can.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'm so thrilled to be joined by Sheida Soleimani and Fabiola Jean-Louis for this International Women's Day Artist Talk. Sheida and Fabiola are, again, two of a number of artists featured in our current exhibition, Uncanny, which is an exhibition that sees modern and contemporary women artists use uncanny imagery to explore their feelings of anguish, revulsion, discomfort. And these artists also use the uncanny to tackle, question, and subvert patriarchal, often westernized conventions of the art world. So what is uncanny? It's one of those terms that's quite ambiguous and difficult to define, but it is described as the psychological experience of seeing something recognizable and familiar, but also mysterious and alien to us. It was a term that preceded Freud, but was popularized by him in 1919 in an essay. So this is the idea that when we see something that's recognizable to us, but at the same time something that we don't recognize about it, something that's familiar and foreign. And that concept will appear over and over again in the different works in the show. The exhibition has nearly 30 artists and almost 70 works, and it ranges from painting, sculpture, photography, and video. And I just want to, again, go through them very quickly and really focus on Fabiola and Sheida's works, but just to kind of give a sense of how they fit in within this larger narrative. There are three themes throughout the exhibition. And one of the first themes is about surrealism. So surrealists of the 20th century were some of the first to really explore this idea of the uncanny through fantastical and dreamlike imagery. And, male surrealists often depicted women as sort of passive figures, as sometimes dehumanized figures, as fetishized figures. And women often co-opted that kind of imagery to reflect their own lived experiences, to live their own expectations of the world, their own emotions. And so you have here on the left, Remedios Varo's depicting a woman with machine body parts, like wheels and gears. So you have like wheels and gears for her legs and her torso, as a commentary on how both women and men are cogs in a machine. We're all cogs in a machine until we achieve some kind of psychological awakening. That's important for us to live fully in this world. And then on the right, we have Leonora Carrington. Shows a supernatural female figure with the power of reading people. And you can see just barely in this image, faces on her palms. She's called the palmist, so she's able to read faces and read people. And around her head, you have a ginkgo leaf, which is one of the oldest and most resilient species of plants. And she also wears the plague doctor's mask. And this suggests that she is powerful and resilient, and she's able to endure many harrowing events through her life and through the years. We have a work by Louise Bourgeois, who's depicting a baby's foot attached to or sticking out from underneath this very, very heavy looking marble orb. So on one hand, you have this very smooth, soft marble that elicits the feeling of tender flesh, of soft flesh that you can see from the baby's leg. And on the other hand, there is a suggestion of dismember and death, right? Or perhaps this monstrous hybrid infant creature that is partially human, partially something else. There's a suggestion of that. Bourgeois gave artistic voice to women's lived experiences at a time when her male peers were not doing these sorts of things. And so she really touched upon issues such as the trauma of birth, such as postpartum depression, and in general, complex feelings around motherhood. And, similarly, moving to the present day, because the exhibition shows both those modern day 20th century surrealists, but also contemporary surrealists. And so you have somebody like Frida Orupabo, who is a Norwegian Nigerian artist who works with Afro-surrealist imagery. So Orupabo's collages fragment, distorts, and multiplies the limbs and forms of women's bodies from colonial photographs. So she goes through different types of sources and collects a head from one source, collects a shoulder or arm from another source, feet from another source, and sort of Frankensteins them together into these sort of new hybrid creatures. And they very intentionally create a strange, phantom-like, otherworldly sensation. And they're also very intentionally confrontational. So that gaze that directs, that looks right back at us is very, very intentional. And she said by staring back, she refuses to be made into an object. And like Bourgeois, she's also commenting on this kind of trauma around childbirth. So for example, in the right image, Labor 2, she's commenting on the experiences of childbirth, but more specifically on the experiences of enslaved women who were ripped apart from their children, forced to take care of somebody else's child. And continuing that into the present day, where Black women have to endure inadequate medical care in the modern medical system. So really connecting the past and the present. We have another theme in the show called Uncanny Valley. And Uncanny Valley is a sort of eerie, creepy feeling that we get when we see images that are almost human, but are also, we know that it's not fully human, that there's something artificial about that. So this is a silicone prosthetic mask by the British artist Gillian Waring. This mask is of her own face, and she works with a team of assistance team of experts from Madame Tussauds who casts, sculpts, paints, and even applies hair to the masks to make them look as human-like as possible. So this is of the artist's own face sleeping. But if you look here on the right, that is of her as a teenager. So she's wearing a mask of her younger self. So she's creating these wigs, costumes. She uses elaborate lighting, and stages and elaborate lighting and staging to recreate these sort of very eerie, hyper-real images disguised as other people. Often, again, they're herself, they're her family members, or they're who she calls her spiritual family, which are art figures throughout history, such as the Mona Lisa or the Surrealist artist Merritt Oppenheim, who's also represented in Uncanny. And then on the left, we have Matilda Terheine, who creates lifelike dolls cast in her likeness, but they represent both real and fictional women throughout history. So the figure on the left is representing the character of Elaine Risley, who is a successful Canadian artist and also the protagonist in The Cat's Eye by Margaret Atwood. So the Uncanny Valley was termed by the roboticist Masahiro Mori, who was, again, using this term Uncanny Valley, and in Japanese was actually called the Valley of Eeriness. He was specifically thinking about robots and androids and technology. And so in that vein, we have a work by Stephanie Dinkins, who, on the right, who has been recording her conversations with Bina 48 on the left. It's a social android modeled to look like Bina Rothblatt. Bina Rothblatt is the partner of the co-founder of Terrorism Movement, which is a foundation promoting the extension of human life using biotechnologies. And so although this robot, this android, is modeled after after Bina Rothblatt, who is an African American woman, using her likeness, her memories, her data, essentially. The people who programmed it are primarily white men. And so the conversations highlight a kind of a lack of diversity in the tech world, both in gender and in terms of race. But if you pay attention to the conversations between them, they revolve around ideas of intelligence, emotions, again, gender and race. Sometimes they're humorous, and sometimes Bina 48 expresses feelings of frustrations. So really this look, and these are videos, there are 4 videos. It's a fascinating look at what it means to be human. And as technology advances more and more, that line between human and technology and the artificial becomes increasingly blurred. And then lastly, we have this theme called unsafe spaces. And this is coming from the German word for uncanny called unheimlich, which translates to unhomely. And so this theme is about spaces and places that are tense, that are unwelcoming, that are potentially inhospitable, uninhabitable. And these are 2 paintings by the artist Julie Roberts, who focuses, and in her composition, she focuses on a single object or a space in front of a really rich, saturated color. So that is sort of her signature look on the left, and then Dormitory on the right is her kind of later work. But often the objects that she depicts in these compositions are images of medical facilities, of medical instruments like straitjackets, like gynecology chairs, operating tables. And she's really pointing to and critiquing how society has exercised power, particularly over the female body. This is Sigmund Freud's study, so Freud's study on the left. And Freud, for example, was one of those figures who initially described the condition of hysteria as a disorder found predominantly in women. He later changed his mind and said men can get it too, but he was also one of those figures that was contributing to this idea of women who went against the expectations of society, who did some things that made men in society feel uncomfortable as being labeled hysterical, right? And women who were labeled as hysterical or who had hysteria were often forced into mental asylums in the 19th century, or sometimes forced to have hysterectomies. So there was some irreparable damage done to women as a result of psychiatry at the time. Julie Roberts also does work that looks at the displacement of children in the 20th century. And these are sort of really emotional imagery that stems from her own experiences in some ways of going through the foster care system when she was younger. This major work is by Berlinda de Broeker. It's a major installation, sculpture/installation, just features a 200-year-old antique wood vitrine with glass doors and fragments of wax-colored branches inside. And these pieces of wood suggest that they might be, as you walk in front of it, that they look almost like bodies or ethnographic specimens on display. And the artist actually talks about how she doesn't want people to think of these as just trees or branches. She wants us to think of them as strange, vulnerable beings. There's something very vulnerable about them. And this work is over 9 feet tall and 15 feet wide. And so there is this really imposing, haunting presence as you're walking back and forth. And she asks that we leave these glass doors open so you can kind of peek inside. So there is something almost anthropomorphic about these trees. This is a video work called Collapse. Again, in that same idea of unsafe spaces. This is by Sama El-Shaibi. And it poetically alludes to the colony collapse of honeybees, which she's using to point to the larger dilemma of our human coexistence with the ecosystem and with each other. She's also using the bees as a metaphor for eco-refugees, for ecological refugees, which are people who are displaced due to environmental changes that threaten their livelihood and well-being. So I use this as an example to show how the planet itself, on a very macro level itself, is becoming an unsafe place for us, as becoming an inhospitable, uninhabitable place for us. Because as you can see on the left, she's showing the planet and our terrains becoming barren and polluted and sort of burning away. So with that very quick overview, I'm going to now turn it over to Sheida Soleimani. And Sheida and Fabiola's works are included in this theme as examples by artists who are looking at the idea of either nation state or homeland, and showing us examples of how those spaces can become unheimlich, can become uncanny, and can become unsafe for us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sheida to talk about the two works that are in the exhibition.
Hey everyone. Thanks so much, Orin, for having me in this exhibition. I'm so excited to be part of such an incredible group of artists, speaking to issues that have always been critical, but really, unfortunately, today feel all that more necessary to discuss. So in my practice, I'm just going to kind of get right into it. My name is Sheida Soleimani. I'm an Iranian-American artist and the daughter of political refugees who escaped Iran in the mid-1980s. And so in my works, I'm really interested in investigating the kind of lapses in understanding between, Eurocentric education systems in the West and what we know about what's happening in the greater Swana region, so Iran being part of that. In my earlier work, in To Oblivion, this image that you're looking at is from To Oblivion. I was starting to think in a series before this, a national anthem, I was thinking a lot about individuals that were persecuted in Iran because of their pro-democratic actions and because of their identities. So femme-identifying individuals, queer folks, like people that were not really allowed to exist in a way that was free under Iranian government and society. And into Oblivion, I started really focusing in more on the women because my own mother was in solitary confinement and was unfortunately tortured because of her pro-democracy beliefs. Also, as someone that was targeted as a way to get access to my father, who had already escaped the country at the time, I'm thinking a lot about, women as scapegoats, especially in Iranian society. It is normalized for aggression to be endorsed on women. So in To Oblivion, I was also thinking about observational psychology For any of you out there that might know Albert Bandura, he was well known for his wire monkey experiment, but he also did another experiment called the Bobo doll experiment, in which he exposed children, two separate groups of children, to a room filled with toys. 20 of those children got to go into the room filled with toys with no direction and played with whatever they wanted. And at the time, in like the late 60s, early 70s, there were these punching kind of bags that were clown-like. They were called Bobo dolls, and they're weighted at the bottom, and you push them, and they just kind of come right back up at you. The first 20 kids went into the room. They did not interact with any of those dolls. They just played with like toys of the time. So Legos, you know, they were drawing, they were building. And so that was the first kind of control group. The second control group actually was given a video to watch before they were, you know, put inside of the room to play with the toys. And the video was a female adult model ignoring all of the other toys in the room and just, you know, interacting with the Bobo doll. She was pushing it, she was punching it, she would take a toy gun and she would hold it up to it, she would sit on it. And of course, children are sponges, and all of those children that watched that video absorbed that behavior and, you know, only went into that room, ignored all of the other toys, and, you know, decided to be aggressive towards the Bobo doll. And so it's not rocket science, but it shows that from an early age, if adult models expose children to, you know, these types of behaviors, children will normalize them. And so the same thing happens in Iranian society. Aggression on women is endorsed, and women are often blamed for things or for crimes they did not commit. And that's what I'm focusing on to oblivion. So I was working with Iranian human rights violation victims that had been executed, working with their, you know, lawyers of their cases, working with their families, getting information about them. All of these photos are given to me by either lawyers from their cases or by their family members. So I think it's really important for me in building a consensual photographic practice to be considerate of where images come from, thinking about photography as, you know, really one of the most awful mediums in the sense that it's male dominated. I mean, every medium is, unfortunately, but the idea of taking the image is really subjugating the, you know, person in the image to become an object. And I wanted to create something consensual by thinking about how to construct an image to build for the camera instead of, you know, the lens really being this thing that penetrates the world non-consensually. So in this image, Delara Dorabi is shown, she was executed after being convicted of murder, even though she did not commit the murder. She was tortured into confessing the murder. All of the evidence proved otherwise, but because they did not want to blame a man for the crime, they executed her anyways. So each one of these photos just kind of touches on recreating their portraits, reanimating them as these Bobo dolls that really didn't get the, you know, fair trials they deserved or the chances at life that they deserved. So that was in 2016, and I guess fast forwarding to the next piece. Many series have passed. A lot of people have always asked me why I didn't focus on my own family, and the question really for me and the answer for me was that the art economy and the art world is addicted to trauma pornography and the pornography of pain. And by thinking about the trauma of others, they fetishize what happens, and they are just, you know, like, oh my God, can you believe someone was tortured? Or can you believe that that woman was in solitary confinement? And that's the last thing that I really wanted to have be a discussion around the images that I would be making of my parents. And so it took me a really long time to negotiate how I would photograph them, how I would tell their stories. And, you know, I just really didn't do it until 2021. So in Ghostwriter, this image Panjere is from my current series Ghostwriter, in which I am speaking to both of my parents and working collaboratively with them to tell the stories of their, you know, pro-democracy resistance, their time as freedom fighters, and their time in hiding as well as confinement. So in Panjere, my mother is sitting inside of a recreation of her solitary confinement cell. And so as a child, oftentimes, you know, we would go out to eat, and back in Ohio, the fancy restaurant to go out to would be Olive Garden. And they would have like paper tablecloths. And because I was a kid, they would bring me crayons. And my mother would use these crayons to make drawings on the tablecloths. And drawing and explaining was really a way for her to process, her trauma. And so she would always do these drawings of her solitary confinement cell on the tablecloths when we would go out to eat. And, to any lay person, they just looked like a strange room that she kept sketching out. But as a kid, I actually would rip off the tablecloth and keep the drawings. And so I've been, kind of keeping an archive of my mom's drawings my whole life. And I thought a lot about what it would mean to recreate these in collaboration with her. So this is one of her drawings of her solitary confinement cell. The rays that are kind of going through that prison bar window structure is actually the direction that the sunlight would come in. And so she described to me how she would, hold up her hands in the light to gain some warmth from the sunlight coming in through the window. I'm thinking a lot about the games that immigrants and refugees have to play to be able to escape. So the checkerboard theme there is a reference to snakes and ladders. The ladder obviously is a form of escape. And then you'll see a little fish crow at the top of that ladder. So as mentioned, I am a federally licensed wild bird rehabilitator, and I have a bird hospital for wild birds. And that's a process of care that I've learned from my mother. She was a bird rehabilitator and a wildlife rehabilitator as I was growing up because she no longer could practice nursing. She was a nurse back in Iran. And so thinking about these types of care that are being passed down, generational, but also something that is born out of trauma. So thinking about this, crow being something that's been harmed by people, just as she has been, being rehabilitated and hopefully released back into the wild. Yeah, that's my current work.
Thank you so much, Sheida. I just have a few follow-ups just to kind of walk us through some of these works. Speaking of the work that we're on, in these recent works, are your sitters, your parents, or anybody else always hiding their faces or partially covering their faces? And can you tell us why that might be?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really important for me. So like I said, I don't think photography is a consensual practice. I think oftentimes when we're looking at someone's face, we are using our tools of categorizing and stereotyping individuals to assign identity to them. And that's one thing I really just don't want to be as, obviously we're going to use like whatever we can to build an identity for someone, regardless of if they're masked or not. But I want to shield them from a sense, from that harm. So I'm also, obviously thinking about phrenology, physiognomy, images of, if you're reading, like looking at criminal photos, you're always looking at someone's like, what shape is their nose? How far apart are their eyes? Like what makes them look a specific way and how can we identify them in that way? So the body in the archive, the Alan Sekula reading is something I think a lot about, like it's just like a primary jumping off point. But the masking is also because they've asked that their identities be protected. And it's extremely important because my father is still very politically active. So it's kind of twofold, thinking about protection for, their safety, but also protection from the gaze.
Now, when I look at these images, obviously there's like the accounts, the narratives are so disturbing or devastating in many ways, but you use these really bright colors. And is that sort of, those bright, warm colors or these like cool tone colors, like are they intentionally sort of jarring with the narratives? Like what is your intention behind using these, behind these sorts of color choices, palettes for your works?
Seduction. I think of color as a Trojan horse, especially in a media saturated economy. We are constantly inundated with images that are traumatic, and we're hearing about traumatic news. And it's that kind of overloading or just the like obsession with the pornography of pain that we often don't really absorb the information or the images that we're looking at. We just know that they're bad or some harm has occurred. And that's not what I want to be happening, in my work. Like, I think these stories obviously are extremely important. These people have been harmed by, state infrastructures, by government infrastructures, and by others. And by just flattening it to make it some photojournalistic image of, oh, these people were harmed, isn't this awful? We really lose the like actual human aspect of things. They become flattened, not only as photographs, but those people become objects. And so for me, I think a lot about the aesthetics of advertising. How can I trick someone into looking at something beautiful that unfortunately has a sinister undertone, getting them to spend time with it, and having that image kind of like unpack or unfurl so they could start to at least become invested in these stories, whether they, know what they're about off the bat or not.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely a good leeway to Fabiola's work, because I think there's definitely an element of that where we're sort of like lured into, the sort of like seduced into this beautiful imagery, and then we're caught off guard by, something that's sinister, as you put, but devastating, all kinds of other kinds of imagery that's sort of a jolt to the system. So with that, I'll let Fabiola speak a little bit more about her work.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Just want to be sure. Okay,
Yes.
great. So thank you for having me. And my name is Fabiola Jean-Louis, and I am a conceptual maker and an alchemist, really. So the work that is in this exhibition is of my photography, which rewriting history was and is a layered project, because I wanted to create and did create gowns that were looking at Eurocentric fashion, so the Baroque, Victorian, and then I made them out of paper and placed them on Black women specifically and photographed them to tell these, not necessarily just to tell different stories, but to not only celebrate the Black woman and her presence, her body, and her beauty, but then also as a juxtaposition to the reality of what historically has happened. But then also there's so many different conversations that I'm having with the work. So with this piece that we're looking at, there's this this dress that the subject is wearing made out of paper, and the text, I believe I took from, it was a really, really old book on capitalism, and I kind of designed something that was leaning towards Baroque. It was really just my own design, and I also wanted it to have this aesthetic of like the skeleton of a Baroque dress stained in coffee. And then of course we can see when we zoom in the chest box that exposes a hanging body and kind of like this rose bush, this rose tree. Because at the very beginning of the work, I was surrounded by a lot of pain and trauma, a lot of people dying at the hands of police officers. And I was reflecting on something that Nina Simone had said in one of her interviews, where she was saying something like, it is an artist's responsibility to respond and to create works that speak to the time that they're living in. And I felt that that's something I really wanted to do with my photography. And I used that opportunity to create this first piece and dress. But so the chest box is something that shows up in the very beginning of my work as kind of an entry point to the spirit, to the soul, to the things that are beyond our humanity, right? What sits beyond the chest wall, and kind of just imagining where that human spirit exists. And for me, of course, the way that I could describe that in a way that would have people understand that is to say the spirit is here, it's within, right? So then we're talking about generational trauma. We're talking about trauma that's passed on, carried through the womb. I really wanted to use that moment on the chest of the dress to talk about that trauma. But then also after doing that, I realized I was also talking about kind of trying to get past this conversation of trauma. Oftentimes what happens, especially with the art of photography, we are trained to look at the subjects, especially when there were like enslaved Gordon, right? A photography of Black bodies. Not, you're not looking at people, you're not looking at living beings, you're looking at this creature through the lens of trauma only, right? So they only kind of just exist within this space of trauma and pain, which is not the full story, obviously. There's an actual being sitting before us and that we're witnessing. And of course, many of them, they did not give permission, nor were they asked for permission to be photographed. So using photography to have that conversation, but then also, using these dresses, these paper dresses, and Black women to push that conversation. So this becomes the first of, I think, I want to say 14 images in the entire collection. And then the next one.
So this was actually the first in the series then.
This was the first in the series. So because it took so long it took months to create one dress, right? Because what we're talking about is not only making the dress, but then finding the model and then photographing and then editing it to give it that painterly aesthetic. It took months. And so what I would do is photograph or capture 2 images of that dress. So the first image that we saw is just a close-up shot of the image. There's another of that dress. There's another photograph that goes with it of the actual subject, Madame Loa, where she's standing right behind a chair, and you can see the full, the full gown and her in it. So this is just one of the images of that dress. And then the next
dress.
This is a remake of that dress. So because the other image was, it was my first dress, I did not know what I was doing. My technique was, there was no one to teach me. I'm completely self-taught. And so even though I had some knowledge of making clothes, because I did go to school, high school fashion industries, I did have some kind of foundation in fashion, but it's something else to do it out of, completely out of paper and then to put it on a human body to be worn. Now, by the time I have made, I want to say my fourth or fifth dress, I completely revamped my technique. I learned all these new skills. And I decided right before my major solo exhibition in Atlanta that I would undo everything and start again. So I redid every single dress in the collection. This dress was part of the new skill set. So it never had to be redone. This was the original dress from the beginning. But the chest box dress, it became more elaborate. That I used better paper. I used inks rather than just acrylic paints because these dresses do tour. I would like them to have some kind of longevity, at least to survive a couple of exhibitions. And so I made this dress to be worn for, they'll say we enjoyed it. And of course the paper shoes. So this is the piece that she wore. And what I love about showing the dresses and then showing, the photographs is that oftentimes people if they just see the dress and not the photograph, they're like, there's no way someone wore that. They're trying to figure out if I photoshopped the dress onto the subject later on. But no, she's actually standing in a paper set that I created. So the curtain behind her is out of paper. The painting behind her, I painted on, a long piece of paper and hung that behind her. And it's a recreation. So a lot of the work in rewriting history, not a lot, I was maybe half of it. Some of them I'm looking at my inspiration. I'm looking at actual paintings that were worn, and, by different women in power. And I'm also looking at paintings. So if I want to include a painting, I'll look at that as inspiration, either recreate it and change it. So what we're looking at in the background is an original painting, an Italian painting, that the scene of rape happens behind closed doors with 3 men in a bedroom, and they are taking advantage of what looks like a Black, ape. But clearly, the point of the painting was that it was a Black woman. So, the narrative of seeing a Black person and a Black woman as non-human, right? So we have this this act that's happening, and that it's kind of justified in this painting as being okay because it's happening to an animal. So I recreated that scene to place it outside, and I made it just with 2 men instead of the 3, because I really wanted to put a dog in there to be the 3rd man, standing regally next to her, next to the subject. Kind of forms this triangle shape, right? So you're looking at the background, but the background is in conversation with what's happening in the foreground. And the dog is really to kind of beg this or make this question, like, who's really the savage? Who's really the animal? Is it the so quote unquote monkey woman, ape woman, or is it these 2 men who are committing this crime, right? And then we have this dog that's almost like more civilized and human, more human than they are. And then also everything, like I said, is layered. This subject that's standing in that dress also is having a conversation about the product of such acts, right? So children who were born from rape, out of rape, and the impact it not only had on those families, but how it impacted Black communities thereafter, and how we deal with colorism and light-skinned people and people who come from this long line of those kinds of acts. So there's a few things happening. And then of course she's wearing a brooch on the dress. So this dress is a remake, a recreation. And so the original dress in the painting had a British emblem on the brooch. I changed that to put a Haitian veve on there for eerily, which is a Loa Haitian Loa that deals with justice and vengeance. And then the 3rd piece that's in the exhibition is actually my last piece in the Rewriting History collection, Follow the Drinking Gourd. So because I'm always dropping little eggs in my in my work, in my photography, there is another rewriting history piece also in the frame, and it's towards the very back, hanging on the wall, titled Whispers of a Revolution. And I felt like, because everything overlaps in rewriting history, that particular piece I loved, because in the background of the one hanging on the wall is the spirit of Toussaint Louverture whispering in the subject's ear of a revolution. And she's a light-skinned Haitian woman who was able to really go between worlds in not only IET, because we did exist. It's not like, I'm just putting these gowns on Black women who never wore these dresses before. They actually did exist and they wore them. But specifically in IET, there were these light-skinned women, these Creole, that they were light-skinned enough to be in certain spaces where they could hear these things. And they would also be able to work alongside very dark-skinned, African enslaved people on the island. And so they played very key pivotal roles in passing messages between, or learning things and being spies that, otherwise wouldn't have had. So she's hanging in that space because it also, so that's the Whispers of the Revolution, talking about the Haitian Revolution, of what helped IET become the first free Black nation in the world. But that's important for this photograph of Follow the Drinking Gourd, because this little girl is in America and she's telling the story of the Underground Railroad. And many people don't realize that, IET became free almost 100 years before the Underground Railroad ever began. And it was messages from the island that were coming here that even let enslaved people know here that that was even possible, that it had happened. So the Underground Railroad is very, very tied to the history of IET. And I'm always looking for a way to overlap those things. And so this little girl is talking to the dollhouse, or the subjects in the dollhouse, which is also made out of paper. So this is the first time that I went beyond just working with the sheets of paper to make dresses and shoes. And I made the little bunny rabbit on the floor, the kind of the gourd with the cotton balls on the floor next to her, and then the dollhouse with the dolls. So the dollhouse exposes the truth of, this abolitionist's house and the soldier that's looking for the people that are hiding in it. And just below, at the very bottom of the house, you can see the secret of the house of the two people hiding, going, shh, like, and the little girl is kind of in that conversation with them saying, shh, they're looking. And its title followed the drinking gourd because, it said that the North Star is what you needed to look at. You need to look up at the sky to, find your way to freedom. And so there's always this conversation about freedom and, my hopes for that. And it's kind of like history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly echoes, right? It's almost the same thing happening over and over again, but it looks different. And even now, the time that we find ourselves, right? It's very true to that time. It's very true to what happened in IET. It's very true to what happened, during civil rights. And this story that we're looking at with the little girl and the Underground Railroad, we keep finding ourselves in this situation.
And the drinking gourd was a term for the Big Dipper that
The Big Dipper,
individuals used to seek freedom and liberation. Yeah, just to again repeat and kind of follow up on what Sheida said, that idea of seduction, all of these are so successful, your imagery in sort of lulling me as the viewer, or lulling people as the visitor, as the viewer, into a false sense of security, right? Like that's, I think, where the idea of the uncanny comes in, with the familiar but foreign, the familiar but mysterious. Because when I see these, it's like, if from afar, it is like a painting or a photograph that I might see in any museum, and they're beautiful, and I look at them, and then all of a sudden I have that jolt of reality where I see, like, oh no, this is speaking to some pretty dark truths about our past and present, ongoing, right? So how, and again, with Fall of the Drinking Gourd, which is one of my favorites, and I've talked to you many times about this, I can feel the tension in this room, right? I can almost hear her shushing. And I can feel the stillness as we're all kind of like waiting with bated breath to see what happens. Does this Confederate soldier find these two people hiding in the bottom level? How do you go about creating this kind of tension and this mood in these photographs? What is your process as you think about each composition, these constructions?
I think that, well, first I'll say that tension is very natural, unfortunately, because of the subject matter, because unfortunately to be Black and to be a woman is political. And then the history that I'm talking about, the present that I'm talking about, all of those things together create naturally this tension. And so I didn't have to work too hard to do that. And matter of fact, because it was the first thing that I realized putting these two things together, or all of these elements together, would do. I kind of was inspired by that. Like, that's exactly what I need to put in that frame. So when I'm thinking about a concept, I'm just taking one little smidget part of something, of history, whether it be a painting, whether it be a moment, an event, a series of things. And I am best trying to decide how I'm going to use this small frame, because, as a photographer, you really just have this one little window, literally the shape of a window, to create all of these stories. And how are you going to give that, how are you going to show the dimensions of all of those things? And so that tension helps me do that very easily. I just have to make the dress and find the subject and put them in it.
And Sheida, I want to connect this to your work with Dalara, because I'm fascinated with your process for these works and how you go about achieving this, because there is a sense of tension here as well, particularly with the way that these sort of the woman's figure is distorted, you know, and it all speaks to the kind of fate that she has met in that space, right? Can you walk us through, you know, the first time you encounter her image online somewhere to this last bit where you have the actual photograph in hand?
Totally. So a lot of these, because most of my family, except for my parents, are back in Iran, I have been hearing, stories from them since I was a child. And like, because my father is very politically involved, this was something that was like really a large part of conversation for us, like even around the dinner table when I was growing up. And so it was no, surprise to me that women like Dilara, like Sakine Mohammadi Ashtiani, like Rehana Jabari, that they were, being blamed for crimes that they did not commit and being executed. The thing that was really devastating for me to see was that there was no trace of these women left. Really, there's not, like, their Facebooks were wiped. There were no images from their trials because half of them didn't even get trials. The trials that they did get were under, Sharia law. So those were not trials in which they actually had any right to speak on their own behalf, or their lawyers didn't even have a chance to do so. And so really there was not much of a trace. When getting in touch with their family members and with their lawyers, that's when I started receiving images from them. And those images were low res. They were sent sometimes via the dark web, and they weren't more than 72 DPI, or pixels per inch. And that means that when they get blown up, these sculptures, for example, of the women are about 5 feet tall sometimes, like on the taller end. And so when you're, blowing something so tiny up to that large scale, you start seeing pixelization. And so that's what these source images in the back, as well as these kind of unfixed, untethered images of them printed on fabric, kind of just become, in a sense, uncanny, but also become, fuzzy. Like, are they real? Are they not? Do they exist? Did they exist? And so that's really the first step for me, is anytime I make a piece, it's about source imagery. And you see the same thing happening in my work in Ghostwriter as well. So the story, comes first, and I think about what are the images that support the story, what are objects that support that story, and I start layering and layering and building. So in this image, this is about a room, like the size of a room, a little smaller than a small room, so 8 by 10 feet. I'm arranging these, pieces of paper, these photos that are folded, and layering and layering and layering. And I was really interested in what you were also saying about when we're looking at mechanized bodies. I'm really interested in Dada collage and thinking about collage as creating these kind of hybridized cyborg forms, and what does it mean to also be a woman in, our contemporary landscape. We are kind of amalgamations of differing identities, differing body parts. We're kind of arranging ourselves and then being flattened over and over. And so I was thinking a lot, not just about that layering and that mechanization, but also about flattening photographically. When you shoot for photographers out there who understand aperture and shutter speed, and I'm not a technical kind of guy, really, but I'm interested in the fact that when you shoot something at, f/24, f/32, that's a really high aperture, which means that everything in your field or your frame should be focused. There's no hierarchy. Everything becomes of equal importance. And so in a sense, that image can become flattened. Everything has equal importance, but at the same time, you're taking something so, I don't know, human and visceral and real, like violence, and reflattening it again. And so photography, in the end, once again, regardless of whether the field is constructed or not, is reasserting that aggression on those bodies. And what does that mean? So yeah, these are built backdrops made almost entirely of paper, fabric. There's some paint, some gestural mark making, but.
Right. So I wanted to make that clear, is that this is not a Photoshop of that photograph that you receive from the lawyers or from the web. This is, you print them on fabric, you stuff them with something to create these soft sculptures to almost evoke those Bobo dolls that you were talking about, and then you create these kinds of constructions, these tableaus, and you photograph them in this in this way. And then you, in interviews, you also talked about how you surround the figures with kind of hints at how they were executed, right? So can you very quickly kind of point to some of this other kind of imagery that surrounds her face in this?
So Delra Darabi, when she was in solitary confinement, one thing that she was allowed to do was to paint, and she became a painter, and she oftentimes painted many other feminized forms that were suffering similar to herself. So a lot of the work, or a lot of her identity that survives her, is her painting. There's also just, you have breasts, and thinking about like, kind of the kissing of like the breast as this like kind of symbol of like final goodbye, or ending of life, like as a it's like more of a cultural, like funerary thing. So I was thinking a lot about that as kind of this, like they're kind of ripped from the body, so it's violent. She has been dismembered, both mentally as well as physically, and also wanting to provide that as like a final kind of memoriam of her. So not always the hints of how they were executed, but more hints about windows into their lives.
And poignant, very poignant and emotional. I kind of fell into a kind of a rabbit hole, kind of looking into her story. I know there's a lot of information, not a lot, but there is some information about her story out there, and it just
Yeah. Which
yeah.
is rare. Amnesty International covered her, and for many of the victims that are covered into oblivion, you don't really see that happening. Every once in a while, every year, hundreds and hundreds of women are executed in Iran without any trace of their, actual lives being left. And so if Amnesty International picks up on one of them, that's fantastic. But what happens to the rest? They just get consigned to oblivion.
In the few minutes we have left, I'll take some questions if there are any. Kelly, if you've noticed any, otherwise I can go on and ask some questions. Can you just let me know?
Yep, I think you can keep going. We don't have any questions yet.
Okay, great. I think everybody is so absorbed with what you both have to say. So I just want to sort of end with this idea of spaces, right? Because again, there are these surrealist threads in both of your works, so certainly it could fit in some of these other themes in the show, but I put you in this idea of unsafe spaces because, again, this idea of unsafe spaces referring to places and spaces that become uninhabitable, feel harmful to us or to someone, to feel unwelcoming, and both of you depict people fleeing their current places of residence, seeking safety, seeking freedom, seeking autonomy elsewhere. But, as we know, home is a very complex idea that can have many meanings attached. So what associations do you have with this idea of home? Is it a place? Is it a person? Is it country and homeland? Or is it a feeling that we have? So Fabiola, do you want to take that up first?
Sure. That is complex for someone that is an immigrant like me. And even though I recently became a US citizen, like literally last month, it took a lot of time for me to do that, because home for me is really IET, and having seen the changes that had to happen in my own family for us to migrate here, and I go back to IT as often as I can. In fact, I am building a home there. Whenever I can fly back and it's safe to fly, I go. So I think home is something for me that it's not necessarily just a physical place, but it's a place where I feel my spirit is able to sing and dance, and has a deeper meaning, that goes far beyond just my human understanding of things, and meaning that IT is a very spiritual place. There, because of voodoo, because of its history, I cannot just walk around when I'm in IET as this human avatar, this avatar just walking around in the matrix. I'm almost just like forced to be my true spiritual self just because of its culture. And I find that I often need to go there to stay tethered to that, to not lose it. And whenever I come back here to the United States, after a certain amount of time, I start to feel, the walls of the matrix are kind of just closing in on me. And so safety really is freedom. My safety is tied to my freedom, and my freedom is my ability to shed my avatar self and to really live in the light of my being. And that is what home is for me.
That is the most beautiful way I've ever had anyone express it to me. That is I'm going to have to go back and quote you. That was really beautiful. Sheida, do you have, what about you? How would you?
What do I even say after that? I mean, that was, beautiful way to put it and so poignant. I mean, I don't think home is anything specific. I think being part of the diaspora is being untethered. You are forcibly ripped from, cannot return to, are not able to, I mean, especially for my parents, like neither of them are able to return. I've been exiled. So there's this distant, kind of idea of home, right? But what does it mean to not have an actual physical relationship with that place? It kind of all becomes like theater of memory. And I'm really interested in what does it mean to live in between? And what does it mean to have a practice in between? What does it mean to bridge that space? Is it through kind of creating these like fictional worlds and spaces that are kind of surreal and dreamlike, but also filled with like violence and death, just like the real world is? But yeah, I think more in the term of like being a diasporic individual, home is not something that is ever going to be fixed. And so you make it where you can, in temporary ways. And I think that's part of like why my practice is also so much about being temporary and unfixed and building these spaces that only exist for the camera and then they're, ripped down. I think a lot about nostalgia as a European Enlightenment medical term, which is a term that many people really talk about when they think about photography as something that's like going to give us like a good kind of like feeling or association, but it's actually a disease that was diagnosed in individuals that were forcibly ripped from home, soldiers and actually enslaved individuals. And so this disease of homesickness, of not being able to return, is what nostalgia was. And I think a lot about that, as a way of considering what home is.
Could talk to you both forever, and I have like a million questions, and particularly what we didn't get to was this, like, you've both hinted at these sort of critiques of photography as a medium and the history of history of the medium, and also how you both work to sort of decolonize that genre, that the lens, essentially the camera lens. So there's so much more to kind of grapple with in both of your work, as well as, the 27, 28 other artists. And, I really hope that people can come see the show, because there's so many more of these so really wonderful, insightful perspectives by the different artists in this exhibition. And I want to thank both Sheida and Fabiola for coming here today and joining us and speaking about their really beautiful, like genuinely beautiful practices that I was immediately taken with. And I should say that the exhibition comes largely out of the collection, and then there were a few works that I definitely wanted that were loan works, and both Fabiola and Sheida were two people that I reached out to lend to the show, because I don't feel like I could fully capture the stories I want to tell, and this idea of the uncanny as being this strategy that women artists use to express themselves without the work of Sheida and Fabiola. So thank you both so much for participating in this project and for speaking to all of us today.
Thank you for having us on the show. I'm so excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you so much again. And I will turn it back to Kelly to sort of close us out.
Thank you. Thank you all. Fabiola, Sheida, Orin, really. This was amazing. Thank you. Thank you. I have a few kind of closing remarks that I will pull you all off stage so you don't have to sit and watch yourselves like I will. I'm sorry, Fabiola. So yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining. Orin, Fabiola, Sheida, thank you again for your time. As a reminder, this program is part of our Women Arts and Social Change Initiative of public programs, and these programs are supported through leadership gifts from Denise Littlefield-Sobel, the Davis DeRay Family Fund, Ann Edwards, and the Rabada Foundation, and the Susan and Jim Swartz Public Programs Fund. So I just want to thank our sponsors for making programs like this happen. In addition to these programs, we've got so much more to offer at NMWA. I encourage you to check out our full lineup of Women's History Month programming at the link in the chat. Like I said, March is really important for us, but so are the other 11 months of the year. We do a ton of incredible work in addition to our programs like this, our exhibitions. We've got so much going on. We do have a special program tomorrow to celebrate International Women's Day. This was kind of our kickoff, our International Women's Day Eve. We have another virtual program at 12 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, all about Frida Kahlo. We're going to give a preview of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts upcoming exhibition on Frida Kahlo. And then that curator will be in conversation with our Director of Digital Engagement, Laura Hoffman, about our plans to make the archive of Frida Kahlo's letters more accessible online. So we encourage you to sign up for that. And I want to say also, we can't do this work without your support. So we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and stay informed about NMWA happenings. Become a member if you're interested. Our membership team does a lot of special member virtual programs. So if you have questions, please reach out to us, but we've got some links in the chat. And again, thank you all for your time. And I hope everyone feels empowered to advocate for gender equality every day, but especially IWD. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.